There are places in this country where the government built things it probably shouldn't have. Not because the engineering was bad, not because the money was wasted, but because the land had already decided what belonged there. And a building wasn't it. I spent the better part of 40 years learning to read wilderness the way some people read faces. You learn which valleys hold weather, which ridgelines talk to each other when the wind changes, which stretches of old-growth timber go quiet for a reason, and which ones go quiet for no reason at all. But I never learned to read Lake Ellicott. If you enjoy these kinds of stories, the real ones, from people who were actually out there, consider subscribing. I've got more to tell, and some of them have been sitting with me for a long time. What happened at the Ellicott Observation Station in September of 2007 has stayed with me differently than the other strange things I've encountered in my career. The others I filed away, accepted, moved past. This one didn't let me do that. This one came with a cost, and the cost wasn't mine alone, which is probably why it still sits the way it does. I need to be honest from the start. I wasn't stationed at Ellicott. I was pulled in. And what pulled me in was a phone call from a man named Dale Seward. Dale was a structural engineer with the National Park Service Regional Office in Denver. We'd worked together twice before, once on a fire lookout decommission in the Cascades, once on a bridge assessment in the Bitterroots. He was 61 years old that September, 8 months from mandatory retirement. And he was one of the most careful human beings I've ever known. He measured things 3 times. He photographed everything. He kept paper notebooks because he didn't trust digital storage. And he filed duplicate copies of those notebooks in separate locations. He was the kind of man who would drive 40 minutes out of his way to double-check that he'd locked a gate. I say all of this because what Dale told me on the phone that Tuesday evening didn't sound like Dale. He said he'd been sent to assess a decommissioned observation station on the northeast shore of Lake Ellicott for potential demolition. The station had been closed since 1999. A concrete and steel structure built in 1971 as a combined weather observation post and water quality monitoring platform. 2 stories, flat roof, bolted to a granite shelf about 90 feet above the waterline, with an access road that had been gated and abandoned when the station went offline. The Park Service wanted the structure removed as part of a broader restoration initiative. Dale's job was to assess the structural condition, document hazardous materials, and produce a demolition feasibility report. Standard work. He'd done it dozens of times. He told me he'd been on site for 3 days and that something was wrong with the building. I asked him what he meant by wrong. He was quiet for several seconds. Then he said the building was too heavy. I didn't understand what that meant. He explained it carefully, the way Dale always explained things methodically, with the patience of someone who assumed you were intelligent but simply hadn't seen the data yet. The structure, according to the original architectural drawings, consisted of poured reinforced concrete walls, a steel frame interior, concrete slab floors on both levels, a steel reinforced concrete roof deck, and standard aluminum frame windows. The total calculated weight of the structure, including all fixed equipment left inside when it was decommissioned, should have been approximately 420 tons. Dale had brought portable load assessment equipment. Part of the demolition feasibility study required him to verify the structural load against the bearing capacity of the granite shelf. He'd taken core samples from the foundation, measured wall thickness, verified rebar placement with a cover meter, and run calculations based on material densities he'd confirmed himself. The building weighed approximately 680 tons, 260 tons heavier than it should have been. I asked if there could be water infiltration. Concrete absorbs moisture over decades. A decommissioned building with no climate control, exposed to Rocky Mountain winters for 8 years, it wasn't unreasonable to expect some weight gain from absorbed water. Dale said he'd already accounted for that. Even assuming maximum saturation of every concrete surface, which his moisture meter readings didn't support, the water weight couldn't account for more than 30 tons. He was looking at an excess of over 230 tons that he couldn't source. I asked if there might be equipment inside that wasn't on the decommissioned inventory. He said the interior was mostly empty. Both floors had been stripped during the 1999 closure. Some bolted-down steel benches remained. A few electrical junction boxes, nothing that could account for this kind of mass. I asked about the roof. Snow load, accumulated debris, anything structural that might have been added after decommission. He said the roof was clean. He'd been up there. Bare concrete deck with a deteriorated elastomeric membrane. No equipment, no debris, no snow. Then he said something that made me sit down. He said the weight wasn't evenly distributed. It was concentrated in the lower level, specifically in the floor slab of the lower level, as if something beneath the building, or within the foundation itself, had become extraordinarily dense. I asked him if he'd checked the subsurface, whether there was a basement or utility vault under the structure. He said the architectural drawings showed no subsurface space. The building was slab-on grade, poured directly onto the granite shelf. There shouldn't be anything beneath it except rock. But his load reading suggested that the greatest concentration of unexplained mass was directly below the ground floor, centered almost perfectly in the middle of the building's footprint. He wanted me to come out. I asked why me specifically. Dale had access to the entire regional engineering staff. He had geologists on call. He could requisition ground-penetrating radar from the Colorado School of Mines in 48 hours. He said he'd already requested GPR. It was scheduled for the following week, but he didn't want to be alone at the site until then, and he didn't want to bring someone from the regional office because he wasn't sure yet whether what he was measuring was real or whether his equipment was malfunctioning. He said he trusted my judgment more than most people's instruments. That was the most personal thing Dale Seward had ever said to me. I drove out the next morning, left Bozeman before dawn, and made the lake by early afternoon. Lake Ellicott sits in a glacial basin on the eastern slope of the northern Colorado Rockies, inside a national park I'll decline to name specifically. It's not a large lake, maybe 1.25 miles long, half a mile wide, shaped roughly like a bent thumbnail. Maximum depth around 240 feet, according to bathymetric surveys from the 1960s, fed by snowmelt from 3 directions and drained by a single creek on its southern end. The water is cold year-round. Even in August, the surface temperature rarely exceeds 50 degrees. The northeast shore, where the observation station sat, was the steepest part of the basin. The granite shelf jutted out from the mountainside like a lower jaw, and the building sat on it about 100 yards from where the rock dropped nearly vertically into the water. The access road climbed about 2 miles from the main park road through a corridor of Engelmann spruce and subalpine fir, switchbacking twice before reaching the gated turnoff. Beyond the gate, another 1/4 mile of deteriorating asphalt led to a small gravel lot in front of the station. I found Dale's truck in the lot, along with a Park Service utility vehicle and a portable equipment trailer. Dale was inside the building's lower level when I arrived. The first thing I noticed about the structure was that it looked exactly like what it was: a government observation station from the early 1970s. Flat, utilitarian, graceless. The concrete had weathered to a pale gray green. Rust streaks ran from every piece of exposed hardware. The windows on the upper level were intact, but filthy. The lower level windows had been boarded with plywood during the decommission, most of which had begun to warp and separate from the frames. The second thing I noticed was the ground. The gravel lot extended to within about 15 feet of the building's south-facing entrance. Between the edge of the gravel and the building's foundation, there was exposed granite, the raw surface of the shelf. And in that granite, in a rough semicircle radiating outward from the foundation wall, there were cracks I didn't expect to see. Not weathering fractures, not frost heave. These were stress fractures, the kind you see in load-bearing rock when something has been pressing on it beyond its designed tolerance. They radiated outward from the building's base in patterns that looked almost concentric, like ripples frozen in stone. Granite doesn't crack like that from the weight of a 2-story concrete building. I've seen fire lookouts perched on granite peaks for 80 years without leaving a mark. This shelf should have supported 10 buildings like this one, without complaint. I found Dale on the lower level, standing in the center of the room with a digital level resting on the floor. The interior was dim. He had 2 battery-powered work lights set up, casting flat white light across bare concrete walls. The space was roughly 40 feet by 30. The ceiling was low, maybe 8 feet. Steel I-beams ran overhead, supporting the upper floor slab. The air smelled like cold mineral dust and something faintly organic that I initially attributed to rodent activity. Dale looked tired. Not in the way a man looks after a long day of physical work. In the way a man looks when something has been keeping him intellectually occupied past the point of rest. He shook my hand and thanked me for coming, and then immediately walked me through his measurements. He'd gridded the floor into 4-foot squares with chalk lines and taken load readings at every intersection. He showed me the data on a clipboard, rows of numbers that meant very little to me individually, but formed a clear pattern when he explained them. The readings increased as you moved toward the center of the room. The perimeter readings were consistent with what you'd expect from a standard concrete slab on granite. But the center readings were anomalous. Significantly anomalous. Whatever was adding weight to this building was concentrated in a zone approximately 12 feet in diameter, directly beneath the center of the lower floor. I got down on my hands and knees and looked at the floor. It was a standard poured concrete slab. No visible cracks, no discoloration at the center, no patches, no repairs, no signs of modification. I knocked on it with my knuckles in several places. The sound was consistent everywhere, the flat, dead report of thick concrete on solid substrate. I asked Dale if he'd brought any acoustic testing equipment. He had a rebound hammer and an ultrasonic pulse velocity tester, both standard for concrete assessment. He'd already used the UPV tester across the entire floor. The pulse velocity through the slab was consistent everywhere, about 4,500 meters per second, typical for sound structural concrete. Whatever was causing the weight anomaly, it wasn't within the slab itself. The slab was behaving normally. The excess mass was below it. I walked outside and circled the building. The granite shelf was visible on 3 sides where the soil was thin or absent. On the north side, the rock dropped away toward the lake. On the east and west, it sloped more gradually into the tree line. I examined the exposed rock surface as closely as I could, looking for any indication of a subsurface void, a sealed access point, a utility chase, anything that might suggest the building had infrastructure below grade that wasn't on the drawings. I found nothing. The granite was continuous, uncut. No drill marks, no patches, no seams. The foundation walls sat directly on the natural rock surface, bonded with what appeared to be the original 1971 pour. I came back inside and told Dale that the exterior showed no evidence of subsurface construction. He nodded. He already knew. We spent the rest of that afternoon going through the building's upper level. The stairs were steel-framed with concrete treads anchored to the east wall. The upper floor was configured as the primary observation space, wider windows on all four sides, a reinforced section of roof where weather instruments had once been mounted, and the bolted remnants of monitoring equipment along the north wall facing the lake. The upper level felt different from the lower level, though I couldn't have told you how in precise terms. The lower level felt compressed, dense, as though the air itself had more substance than it should. The upper level felt merely abandoned, dusty, empty in the ordinary way that empty buildings feel empty. Dale noticed it too, though he described it in engineering terms. He said the acoustic behavior of the lower level was unusual. Sound didn't carry the way it should in a hard-walled concrete room. Voices seemed to lose energy faster than the room's geometry predicted. He'd noticed it on his first day and initially attributed it to the plywood over the windows, absorbing some of the sound. But he'd pulled one of the plywood panels to test the theory, and the acoustic character of the room hadn't changed. I asked him whether the floor temperature was consistent across the slab. He looked at me with the expression of a man who had just realized someone else had noticed something he'd been reluctant to mention. He pulled an infrared thermometer from his kit. We started at the south wall and walked toward the center, taking readings every 2 feet. The concrete near the walls was 48 degrees Fahrenheit, typical for an unheated concrete structure in a Rocky Mountain September. At 8 feet from the wall, the temperature was 46 degrees. At the center of the room, directly over the zone of maximum anomalous load, the floor was 39 degrees, a 9-degree differential across 20 feet of continuous concrete slab with no draft, no moisture variation, and no mechanical cooling. The cold was coming from below. Dale and I stood at the center of the room and looked at each other. He didn't say anything dramatic. He didn't speculate. He simply wrote down the temperature readings in his notebook, added the time and date, and said he thought we should call the park's resource management office in the morning and request historical geological data for the site. We set up our camp that evening in the gravel lot about 50 yards from the building. Dale had a small travel trailer hitched to his truck. I pitched a tent beside it. The evening was cool and clear. The lake was visible from the lot through a gap in the spruce to the north, a dark, flat expanse that reflected the first stars with the fidelity of polished metal. We ate a simple dinner at Dale's folding table and talked through the data. Dale was meticulous in conversation the same way he was meticulous in his work. He presented possibilities in order of probability and dismissed each one only after explaining exactly why the evidence contradicted it. Hidden subsurface void. Unlikely, the UPV readings through the slab showed no void signature beneath the concrete, and the granite surface around the building was unbroken. Water table anomaly. Impossible at this elevation and geology. The shelf was solid granite. There was no aquifer. Undocumented construction. Possible in theory, someone could have excavated into the granite before pouring the foundation in 1971. But the architectural records included geotechnical survey data from 1969, and those surveys described the shelf as solid, competent granite to a tested depth of 40 feet. No voids, no fracture zones, no anomalies, mineral deposit. This was the option Dale kept returning to. A dense metallite or sulfide body directly beneath the building that wasn't detected during the original survey. It was the only natural explanation that could account for concentrated subsurface mass. But even this had problems. The density required to produce the load readings Dale was measuring would require something far heavier than any common mineral deposit. He'd run the numbers. Even if the zone beneath the building contained solid galena, one of the densest common minerals the volume required, didn't fit within the 12-foot diameter zone unless it extended at least 15 feet below the slab. And galena deposits don't produce cold spots. We sat with that for a while. The lake was silent below us. No wind, no insect noise. It was too late in the season and too high in elevation. Just the kind of quiet that exists in places where the air is thin and the nearest human sound is miles away. I asked Dale if anything else unusual had happened during his 3 days on site. Anything he hadn't mentioned on the phone. He took his time answering. He cleaned his glasses, folded his napkin, set his coffee cup precisely in the center of its saucer. Then he told me about the water. On his second morning, he'd arrived at the building to find a thin film of water on the lower level floor. Not much. Maybe 1/8 of an inch deep across the center of the room, tapering to dry concrete at the walls. He'd assumed a roof leak, though it hadn't rained. He checked the ceiling, the walls, the window boards. Everything was dry. He mopped the water up with shop towels, examined it. Clean, cold, no sediment, no discoloration. He smelled it. Nothing. He tested the floor for cracks with a dye penetrant. No cracks. The slab was intact. 6 hours later, when he returned from lunch in his trailer, the water was back. Same distribution, same depth, same cold, clean character. He mopped it again, set up a time-lapse camera aimed at the center of the floor, and left the building for 90 minutes. When he reviewed the footage, the water wasn't there for the first 82 minutes. Then, in the span of about 3 minutes, the floor became wet. Not from any visible source. Not from above. Not from the edges. Not from a crack. The concrete simply became wet, as though the water were migrating upward through solid, uncracked structural concrete from the granite below. Dale showed me the footage on his laptop. I watched it twice. He was right. There was no visible source. The floor was dry, and then it wasn't. And the transition was smooth and uniform across the center of the room, as though the concrete had begun to sweat. I asked him why he hadn't mentioned this on the phone. He said because he didn't have an explanation, and he didn't want to describe something he couldn't explain to someone who hadn't seen the data. He'd wanted me to see the measurements first. The weight anomaly was objective, reproducible. The water was harder to frame professionally. I understood. Dale wasn't the kind of man who reported mysteries. He reported findings. And a finding requires enough context to be evaluated. He'd wanted to build that context before showing me something that could sound irrational without it. We turned in around 9. The temperature dropped into the low 30s. I could see my breath in the tent. The sleeping bag was adequate, but not generous. And I lay awake for a while, listening to the particular quality of silence that exists in high mountain basins. A silence so complete that you become aware of your own circulatory system. Sometime after midnight, I woke. Not suddenly, not from a dream. I simply transitioned from sleep to wakefulness with an unusual clarity, as though my brain had decided I needed to be conscious. I lay still and listened. Nothing. No wind, no animal sounds. The silence of the basin was absolute. Then I felt it, a vibration, not audible, not exactly tactile, something between the two, a low, pervasive thrumming that seemed to come from the ground itself, transmitted through my sleeping pad and into my spine. It had no rhythm, no pulse. It was continuous, like the hum of a transformer heard from a great distance. except I wasn't hearing it. I was feeling it. I unzipped the tent and stepped out. The sky was brilliant with stars, the Milky Way, a dense, textured band from horizon to horizon. The air was perfectly still. The vibration was stronger outside. Standing on the gravel, I could feel it through my boot soles. A steady, subsonic presence emanating from the direction of the building. I walked to Dale's trailer and knocked quietly. He opened the door within seconds. He was already dressed. He asked if I felt it. I said yes. He said it had started 20 minutes ago, the third night in a row. We stood in the gravel lot in the dark, two men past the age of casual adventure, listening to something we couldn't hear with a frequency below human perception that was nonetheless undeniable. The vibration wasn't aggressive. It didn't escalate. It simply existed, a constant, sourceless pressure that seemed to saturate the granite shelf the way heat saturates stone on a summer afternoon. Except this carried no warmth. If anything, the air near the building felt colder than it should have, even accounting for radiative cooling on a clear night at 9,000 feet. Dale had already documented the previous two occurrences. Both had started between midnight and 1 in the morning. Both lasted approximately 3 hours. Both ceased gradually rather than abruptly, the vibration diminishing over a period of 15 to 20 minutes, until it became indistinguishable from the normal, microseismic background of a mountain environment. He'd placed an accelerometer on the lower-level floor during the second occurrence. The instrument had recorded low-frequency oscillation between 2 and 8 Hz, well below the threshold of human hearing, but within the range detectable by the vestibular system, and, at sufficient amplitude, the human body generally. The amplitude was low, barely above the noise floor. But it was there, and it was structured, not random. Not the broadband noise of distant seismic activity or wind-induced ground coupling. It had peaks, defined frequencies that repeated consistently throughout the recording. I asked if there was any mining activity in the region. Abandoned mines, old prospect tunnels, anything that could be producing sympathetic vibration through the bedrock. Dale said no. He'd checked. The nearest historical mining activity was 14 miles south, in a different drainage, in a different geological formation. And those mines had been sealed since the 1940s. I asked about the lake. He paused at that. He said he'd considered it. Large bodies of cold water in confined basins can produce unusual acoustic phenomena, seiches, thermocline oscillations, even ice-related sounds in winter. Though this was September and the lake was ice-free. But he hadn't been able to construct a mechanism by which lake oscillation would transmit through bedrock as a structured subsonic signal. Water doesn't couple to granite that way. We stood there for another 10 minutes. The vibration continued, unchanged, steady, patient, like the breathing of something that had no reason to hurry. I walked toward the building. Dale followed. We stopped about 20 feet from the south entrance. The vibration was perceptibly stronger here. I put my hand flat against the exterior concrete wall. I could feel it in my palm, a faint, continuous tremor, as though the wall were a membrane stretched over something that was slowly, quietly resonating. I moved my hand to different points on the wall. Near the foundation, the vibration was strongest. Higher up, near the window line, it diminished. Whatever was producing this was coming from below, transmitting upward through the structure's contact with the granite. Dale said he wanted to go inside. I asked if that was wise at 1 in the morning. He said the accelerometer was still on the lower level floor and he wanted real-time readings during an active event. His previous recording had been retrieved after the vibrations ceased. He'd never been inside the building while it was happening. We retrieved flashlights from his trailer. Dale took his laptop and connected it to a handheld data acquisition unit that could interface with the accelerometer wirelessly. We walked to the south entrance. The steel door was unlocked. Dale had removed the decommissioned padlock on his first day for repeated access. The door opened inward. The darkness of the lower level was immediate and complete. Our flashlight beams cut pale lines through air that felt heavier than it should have. That compressed quality I'd noticed during the afternoon was more pronounced now. Not claustrophobic exactly, but present. The room felt smaller than its dimensions justified. The accelerometer was where Dale had left it, a small gray box bolted to a steel plate in the center of the floor, directly over the zone of maximum anomalous mass. Dale powered up his data acquisition unit, and within 30 seconds was reading live output on his laptop screen. The readings confirmed what we were feeling. Continuous oscillation, low frequency, structured peaks at 3.2 Hz, 4.7 Hz, and 7.1 Hz. Amplitude slightly higher than his previous recording, though still technically classified as microseismic, below the threshold that would be considered structurally significant by any engineering standard. But it wasn't the readings that held my attention. It was the floor. The concrete at the center of the room was wet again, the same thin film of water Dale had described. I could see it in my flashlight beam, a dark, reflective sheen across an area maybe 10 feet in diameter, centered on the accelerometer. The water was perfectly still. No ripples despite the subsonic vibration we could feel through the soles of our boots. That seemed wrong. Water that thin should respond to even minor vibration. It should have shown some surface disturbance. Instead, it lay flat and motionless, as though it were denser than water should be, or as though it were adhering to the concrete rather than simply resting on it. I crouched at the edge of the wet zone and touched the water with my fingertip. It was cold, significantly colder than the ambient air. I estimated mid-30s, just above freezing. I rubbed it between my thumb and forefinger. The viscosity felt normal. It looked like water. But when I brought my fingers to my nose, there was a faint mineral smell. Not sulfur, not iron. Something I didn't have a reference for. Clean, but somehow old. The way the air in deep caves smells old, not stale, not decayed, but ancient. As though the water had been somewhere untouched for a very long time before arriving on this floor. Dale was watching his laptop. He said the vibration frequency was shifting. The 3.2 Hz peak was dropping slowly. 3.1, 3.0, 2.8. The other peaks were holding steady. He said this was the first variation he'd observed. The previous recording had shown stable frequencies throughout. I stood up and became aware of something I couldn't immediately quantify. A sensation of attention. Not sound, not movement, not any specific sensory input I could identify. Just the sudden, visceral awareness that the room was no longer neutral. That something in the building or below it had registered our presence in a way that went beyond the mechanical fact of our weight on the floor. I've experienced that feeling before. Once with a mountain lion I couldn't see on a ledge above a trail in Montana. Once in a burned-out cabin in the North Cascades that turned out to have an injured black bear in the root cellar. Your body knows when it's being evaluated by something with intention. The hair stands, the breathing shallows. Every ancient alarm in the human nervous system activates simultaneously, not with panic, but with readiness. This was that feeling. Except there was nothing alive in that room besides the two of us. Dale felt it too. He stopped looking at his laptop and looked at me. I saw confirmation in his face, not fear, not yet, but the rigid alertness of a man whose professional composure was being tested by something his training hadn't prepared him for. The vibration shifted again. The lowest frequency dropped below 2 hertz. I couldn't feel it in my feet anymore, but I could feel it somewhere deeper in my chest, maybe, in the cavity of my torso, as though the building were resonating at a frequency that was coupling with the air volume in my lungs. The water on the floor moved, not in response to vibration. It moved directionally. The entire film, the full 10-foot circle of it, shifted approximately 6 inches toward the north wall, smoothly, uniformly, as though the floor had tilted, except the floor hadn't tilted. Dale's digital level was still on the slab near the east wall, and its display still read 0.0. The floor was perfectly flat. The water moved anyway. Then it moved back, 6 inches south. Same speed, same uniformity. And then it was still again. Dale closed his laptop. He looked at the water. He looked at me. He said very quietly that he thought we should go outside. We left. Dale locked the door behind us, which struck me as an absurd gesture under the circumstances, but was so perfectly characteristic of the man that I didn't comment on it. We walked back to the gravel lot and stood between our vehicles. The vibration was still present, but weaker out here. Attenuated by distance, or perhaps by the difference between standing on the granite shelf directly and standing on 6 inches of compacted gravel. I asked Dale to tell me what he was actually thinking. Not his professional assessment, not his measured hypotheses. What he, Dale Seward, a man with 36 years of engineering experience, actually believed was happening inside that building. He took off his glasses and rubbed his eyes. He put them back on. He looked at the building, a dark rectangular silhouette against the star field, featureless and blunt, the most boring structure the federal government had ever produced. He said he believed there was a mass beneath the building that wasn't geological. He believed that mass was active. He believed it was producing structured vibration with identifiable frequency peaks that changed in response to stimulus, specifically in response to human presence inside the structure. He believed the water was a byproduct or a medium or a mechanism associated with that mass, and he believed it had moved under its own volition. He said he didn't believe any of those things comfortably. I asked him what he wanted to do. He said the GPR unit was arriving Monday. It was now early Thursday morning. He wanted to continue his structural assessment during daylight hours, document everything we observed, and wait for ground-penetrating radar to give us an image of whatever was beneath that slab. 4 days. I could stay 4 days. We went back to bed, though I doubt either of us slept much. The vibration continued until approximately 3:40 a.m. by Dale's wristwatch, then tapered off over 20 minutes exactly as he'd described. By 4 o'clock, the night was silent again, and the granite beneath us felt like nothing more than cold rock. Morning came gray and slow. A thin overcast had moved in from the northwest, dropping the cloud ceiling to perhaps 1,000 feet above the ridgeline. The lake was the color of steel. The temperature hovered around 37 degrees at dawn, warming to the mid-40s by the time we'd finished coffee and oatmeal at Dale's folding table. I walked to the building alone while Dale organized his equipment for the day's work. In the daylight, the station looked inert, ordinary. The cracks in the granite shelf were still there, still radiating from the foundation in those concentric patterns, but they looked less dramatic in the flat morning light. I could almost convince myself they were natural weathering features if I hadn't known better. I circled to the north side of the building, the side that faced the lake. The granite shelf extended about 100 yards beyond the structure before dropping steeply to the water. The slope was mostly bare rock with sparse vegetation in the cracks. A few hardy grasses, some lichen, a single twisted limber pine that had found enough soil in a fissure to survive, but not enough to thrive. The lake itself was calm, almost perfectly so. The overcast sky eliminated glare, and I could see into the water clearly for the first time. Near the shore, the bottom was visible pale granite boulders, some submerged talus, the clean, rocky substrate of an oligotrophic alpine lake. But the depth increased rapidly. Within 50 feet of the shoreline, the bottom disappeared into a blue-black darkness that gave no indication of what lay below. I realized I was staring at the lake, the way you stare at a door you expect to open. I made myself turn away. Dale and I spent the morning on a systematic exterior survey. He wanted to document every visible crack in the shelf, measure their width and depth, photograph them, and map their distribution relative to the building's footprint. I helped hold the measuring tape and took notes while he worked. The cracks were more extensive than I'd initially appreciated. They didn't just radiate from the foundation. They formed a pattern that extended nearly 40 feet from the building in every direction where granite was exposed. The widest cracks were near the foundation, some approaching a quarter-inch, and they narrowed progressively with distance until they became hairline fractures barely visible to the naked eye. Dale said the pattern was consistent with concentrated subsurface loading, something heavy pressing upward against the underside of the shelf. He said the granite itself was competent. The cracks hadn't compromised its structural integrity, but the stress pattern suggested the load had been present for a significant period. Years, possibly. Decades. This wasn't something that had appeared recently. I asked if the building itself could be producing the stress. 420 tons pressing down on the shelf from above. He showed me his calculations. The building's designed load, distributed across its foundation footprint, produced a bearing pressure well within the granite's capacity. He'd verified this against the original geotechnical data. The shelf could support the building 10 times over without cracking. These cracks were being produced by something else, something pressing from below. Around 11 that morning, a park ranger named Mia Cortez drove up the access road and parked in the gravel lot. She was the resource management liaison assigned to Dale's project, his point of contact with the park for permits, access, and coordination. She was in her early 30s, compact and efficient, with the professional directness of someone accustomed to managing multiple field projects simultaneously. Dale had contacted her office the previous day to request historical geological surveys for the Lake Ellicott area. She'd come to deliver them in person, along with a box of archived documents from the park's administrative history files that she thought might be relevant. We set up at Dale's folding table and went through the materials. There were 3 geological surveys, 1956, 1968, and 1991, along with a collection of hydrological studies related to water quality monitoring, which had been the observation station's primary mission during its operational years. The geological surveys confirmed what the 1969 geotechnical data had shown. The granite shelf was part of a Precambrian intrusion, competent rock, no voids, no fracture zones, no unusual mineral concentrations. The 1991 survey, conducted for a trail construction project on the opposite side of the lake, included seismic refraction data that showed continuous, solid granite throughout the basin walls to a depth of at least 150 feet. But it was the hydrological data that changed things. The observation station had monitored Lake Ellicott's water quality from 1971 until its closure in 1999. 28 years of monthly readings, temperature profiles, dissolved oxygen, pH conductivity, turbidity, nutrient levels, all recorded by hand in logbooks that Mia had found in the park's archive. I wasn't a hydrologist, Dale wasn't either, but Mia had a degree in environmental science, and she began flipping through the logbooks with the focused attention of someone who understood what she was reading. After about an hour, she stopped on a page and held it flat on the table. The entry was from October 1987, a routine monthly reading. Most parameters were normal. But the station operator had noted something unusual in the remarks column. A handwritten annotation read, "Conductivity anomaly at depth. 220 feet reading 3 times surface value. Instrument recalibrated and retested. Reading confirmed. No explanation. See Incident Report 87-41. Mia searched through the box for Incident Report 87-41. She didn't find it. She kept reading through the logbooks. Over the next several years of data, 1988 through 1994, the deep water conductivity readings showed a gradual, steady increase. By 1994, the conductivity at 220 feet was nearly 5 times the surface value. The operator's notes became increasingly detailed. Multiple recalibrations, replacement of the conductivity probe, verification with a backup instrument. The readings were real. High conductivity in deep lake water usually means one thing: dissolved minerals. A subsurface spring or hydrothermal input introducing mineral-laden water into the lake at depth. But every geological survey of the basin had concluded there was no subsurface hydrological connection. The lake was fed exclusively by surface runoff and snowmelt. It sat in a sealed granite bowl. Then, in August 1995, the entries changed character. The operator, a different person by then, according to the handwriting, began noting temperature anomalies at depth. The deep water was getting colder, not the normal seasonal thermocline variation. The bottom of the lake was cooling year-round, independent of surface conditions. By the winter of 1996, the deep water temperature had dropped to 33 degrees Fahrenheit, barely above freezing, and colder than any previous winter reading in the station's history. Alongside the temperature drop, the operator recorded something else: acoustic anomalies. During deep water sampling using a weighted Niskin bottle on a steel cable, the operator reported feeling vibration transmitted through the cable. Low frequency, continuous, strongest at maximum depth. The entry from March 1997 read, "Vibration felt in cable at depth exceeding 200 feet. Consistent with previous occurrences. No mechanical source identified. Duration approximately 40 minutes during sampling." Mia looked up from the logbook. Dale was absolutely still. I read the entry again. Vibration. Low frequency. Coming from the deep water. Transmitted through a steel cable. The same characteristics we'd felt through the granite shelf the previous night. Whatever was vibrating beneath the observation station was also present or connected to something present at the bottom of the lake. Mia asked what kind of structural assessment required this level of historical research. Dale told her the truth. Not all of it. Not the water on the floor or the movement we'd witnessed at 1 a.m. But the weight anomaly, the stress fractures in the granite, and the subsonic vibration. He framed it as an engineering concern, unexplained subsurface loading that needed to be understood before demolition could proceed safely. Mia listened carefully. She asked whether there was any possibility of volcanic activity. Colorado isn't typically associated with active volcanism, but there are geothermal features in parts of the state, and she wanted to rule it out. Dale said he'd considered it. The geology didn't support it. The Precambrian granite in this basin was among the most volcanically inert rock on the continent. No hot springs, no fumaroles, no elevated radon, no sulfur. Mia asked about the 1999 station closure, whether the reason for decommissioning might be connected to these anomalies. That was a question none of us had asked yet. The official closure documentation, which Dale had reviewed before his trip, cited budgetary constraints and the transition to automated monitoring systems as the reasons for decommissioning. Standard, bureaucratic language. But Mia's question sent her back into the archive box. She found a memo dated June 1998 from the station's last full-time operator to the park superintendent. It was typed on a government form. The subject line read, "Request for reassignment, personal safety concern." The memo was brief. The operator, whose name I'll omit, stated that conditions at the Ellicott observation station had deteriorated to a point where he no longer felt safe occupying the building during overnight monitoring shifts. He cited recurring equipment malfunctions, unexplained water intrusion on the lower level, persistent vibration of unknown origin, and what he described as an increasingly oppressive physical environment that I believe may represent an unidentified structural or geological hazard. He requested immediate reassignment to another duty station. The superintendent's handwritten reply was in the margin. Approved. Station closure under review. The station was decommissioned 5 months later. Mia read the memo twice. She set it on the table and squared its edges with the other documents, as though neatness could impose order on what we were learning. She said she'd like to stay through the afternoon. Dale had no objection. Neither did I. A third set of eyes, particularly eyes trained in environmental science, couldn't hurt. We spent the afternoon inside the building. The lower level was dry when we entered. No water on the floor. The temperature readings were consistent with the previous day's colder at the center, warmer at the walls. The vibration was absent. During daylight hours, the building felt inert. Heavy and silent and cold, but inert. Dale walked Mia through his measurements. She examined the data with the focused skepticism of someone trained to evaluate environmental claims critically. She verified his methodology, questioned his calibration records, and asked whether his load-sensing equipment could be affected by magnetic fields, temperature gradients, or substrate conductivity. Dale answered every question patiently. His equipment was rated for the conditions. His calibration was current. His methodology was standard. The readings were real. Mia went outside and spent an hour on the granite shelf with a geological hand lens and a rock hammer, taking her own samples from the stress fractures. She photographed the crack patterns. She measured the bearing of each major fracture relative to the building's footprint. When she came back inside, she said the fracture pattern was unusual, not just because of its concentration around the building, but because of its orientation. Stress fractures in loaded granite typically propagate along existing foliation planes or weakness zones in the rock. These fractures were cutting across the grain of the granite, through the strong axis of the crystal structure, not around it. That required substantially more force than fracturing along natural weakness planes. She said whatever was producing the load was pressing hard enough to break granite in its strongest orientation. She didn't know of a natural geological process that would do that from below, in this geological context, without any surface expression other than the cracks themselves. The three of us stood in the lower level of the observation station as the afternoon light dimmed and the overcast thickened outside. The room felt like what it was, a sealed concrete box sitting on a rock shelf above a cold lake, with something beneath it that none of us could explain. Dale asked Mia whether the park had bathymetric data for Lake Ellicott more recent than the 1960s surveys. She said she'd have to check. The original bathymetric map showed a maximum depth of 240 feet near the center of the lake. But that survey was nearly 50 years old, and to her knowledge, it hadn't been repeated. Dale said he wanted current depth data. Specifically, he wanted to know whether the lake bottom beneath the deepest point had changed. Mia asked why. Dale looked at me. I nodded. He told her about the water on the floor, the time-lapse footage, the directional movement. He told her about the nocturnal vibration and the accelerometer data. He told her about the frequency shift that occurred when we entered the building. Mia listened without interrupting. When he finished, she didn't express disbelief. She didn't express fear. She asked a single question. She asked whether the water that appeared on the floor could be lake water. None of us had tested it. Dale retrieved a clean sample bottle from his equipment trailer. We entered the building. The floor was still dry. We left the uncapped bottle sitting in the center of the floor, at the point of maximum anomalous mass, and withdrew to the lot. Mia said she had a portable conductivity meter in her truck. If the floor water reappeared and we could collect a sample, we could compare its conductivity to the lake surface water and to the deep water readings in the historical logbooks. If the conductivity matched the anomalous deep water values, the water on the floor was coming from the bottom of the lake, through 240 feet of water and 90 feet of solid granite. None of us said what that would mean. We didn't need to. The overcast lowered through the evening. By dark, the clouds were sitting on the ridgeline, and a light mist had developed, not rain, just the kind of atmospheric moisture that exists when clouds descend to ground level in the mountains. Visibility dropped to perhaps 200 yards. The lake disappeared entirely behind the veil of mist and spruce. We ate dinner together at Dale's table. The three of us crowded into his small trailer to escape the dampness. Mia had decided to stay the night. She had a sleeping bag and pad in her truck, standard backcountry kit for a ranger who might get weathered in on any given day. She'd radioed the park's dispatch to update her status and was cleared to remain on site. Over dinner, Mia told us something she'd been considering since reading the 1998 reassignment memo. She said the park's administrative records for the Ellicott station were unusually thin. Most decommissioned facilities had extensive files inspection histories, maintenance logs, visitor reports, environmental compliance records. The Ellicott file contained the architectural drawings, the decommission checklist, and the closure order. Almost nothing else. The water quality logbooks had been found in a separate archive, misfiled under the lake's watershed management records, rather than the station's facility records. She said it looked like someone had deliberately separated the operational data from the facility data. The station's file told you what the building was. The watershed file told you what the building had experienced. And the two had been placed where they were unlikely to be reunited by anyone who wasn't specifically looking for both. I asked if she thought that was intentional. She said she didn't like to assume intent without evidence, but she acknowledged that the effect was the same whether it was intentional or not. Anyone reviewing the Ellicott station for demolition would see a straightforward decommissioned structure. They wouldn't see the 28 years of anomalous data collected inside it. Dale said the demolition feasibility report he'd been sent to produce was based on exactly that limited file. A concrete building on a granite shelf. Simple, standard, approved for removal. He hadn't been told about the water, or the vibration, or the conductivity anomalies, or the operator's reassignment request. He'd been sent to assess a building the way you'd assess any other aging structure. Measure it, photograph it, calculate the cost of tearing it down. The question of what the building was sitting on had never been part of his assignment. The vibration started at 12:47 a.m. I was awake already. I'd been lying in my tent with my eyes open, watching the faint condensation of my breath disappear into the darkness above my face. Waiting for it the way you wait for a sound you've been told is coming. When it arrived, it was almost a relief. The uncertainty of anticipation replaced by the certainty of experience. The same subsonic pressure, the same sourceless thrumming transmitted through the granite and into my bones. I dressed and stepped outside. Dale was already at his trailer door. Mia emerged from her truck 30 seconds later, pulling on a fleece jacket, her hair flattened on one side from sleep. Nobody spoke for a moment. We stood in the mist-dampened gravel lot and felt the earth hum beneath us. Mia said it was stronger than she'd expected. Dale confirmed it was stronger than the previous night. He could feel it in his sternum. I could too, that resonant coupling with the chest cavity that had begun to develop during our interior observation the night before. Except now it was present even from 50 yards away. Dale retrieved his data acquisition unit and connected wirelessly to the accelerometer still positioned on the lower-level floor. The readings appeared on his laptop screen in the dim blue glow. The same 3 frequency peaks, but the amplitude was higher, approximately 40% higher than the previous night. And there was a 4th peak now, at one point 4 hertz, that hadn't been present before. Below the range of feeling for most people, but the instrument registered it clearly. Mia looked at the data and asked whether the frequency structure reminded Dale of anything in his experience. He said no, not in his experience. But the structured, multi-frequency character of the signal, with defined peaks and consistent spacing, resembled a harmonic series. As though something was resonating at a fundamental frequency and producing overtones. The way a struck bell produces a primary tone and a cascade of related frequencies above it. Except in this case, the fundamental frequency was below 1 hertz, essentially subperceptual. And the resonating body, whatever it was, would have to be enormous to produce a fundamental that low. Dale estimated the wavelength at over 300 meters. The resonating medium would need to be at least half that length in its longest dimension, 150 meters, nearly 500 feet. The lake was 240 feet deep. The granite shelf sat 90 feet above the waterline. If something extended from the deepest point of the lake upward through the water and into the bedrock beneath the building. The total vertical distance was roughly 330 feet, 100 meters. Not quite large enough to match Dale's estimate, unless the resonating body extended laterally as well out beneath the lake bed, or deeper into the earth than the bathymetric surveys had measured. I didn't share this calculation out loud. I suspect Dale had already run it. Mia asked whether we should go inside and check the sample bottle. I looked at Dale. He looked at the building. In the mist, it was barely visible, a dark geometric absence in the slightly less dark surroundings. No lights, no features. Just a shape that shouldn't have been unsettling, but was. He said yes. We approached together. The vibration intensified with proximity. By the time we reached the entrance, I could feel it in my jaw. A faint but persistent buzzing in my teeth. The way you feel a dentist's drill transmitted through bone before it touches the nerve. Mia put her hand on the concrete wall and held it there for several seconds. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. Her expression was sufficient. Dale unlocked the door. The darkness inside was absolute. Our flashlights seemed weaker than they had the previous night. Though I suspect that was perception rather than reality, the mind interprets light differently when it's anxious. The sample bottle was where we'd left it, sitting upright on the concrete floor at the center of the room. It was full, not overflowing, not partially filled, full to within a centimeter of the rim, as though someone had carefully poured water into it and stopped precisely before it could spill. The floor around the bottle was wet. The same thin film, the same 10-foot diameter. The same still, reflective surface that seemed to absorb flashlight rather than reflect it properly. But tonight, there was more water than Dale had previously described. The film extended farther from the center 12, maybe 13 feet in diameter, and it appeared slightly deeper. Still a shallow film, but enough to see your boot sole displace it when you stepped. Mia crouched at the edge of the wet zone and took a water temperature reading with Dale's infrared thermometer. 34 degrees, 1 degree warmer than the deep lake readings from 1996. Close enough to be significant. She then pulled the conductivity meter from her jacket pocket. It was a small handheld unit, the kind used for field water quality assessments. She dipped the probe into the film at the edge of the wet zone. The reading stabilized at 847 microsiemens per centimeter. She checked the unit, cleared it, tested again. Same reading, 847. Lake surface water in an oligotrophic alpine lake typically reads between 10 and 50 microsiemens. The 1994 logbook entry had recorded deep water conductivity at approximately 5 times the surface value, maybe 150 to 200 microsiemens, assuming the surface was around 30 to 40 at the time. This water was 4 times higher than even the most anomalous historical deep water reading. Mia stood up slowly. She said very carefully that this water did not come from the lake surface. And if it came from the lake bottom, the conditions down there had changed dramatically since the last recorded measurement in 1999. She picked up the sample bottle, held it up to her flashlight. The water inside was clear, perfectly transparent. No particulates, no color. It looked like the cleanest water any of us had ever seen. She capped the bottle and placed it in her jacket pocket without further comment. The vibration was stronger inside the building, not dramatically so, but enough that the difference between outside and inside was unambiguous. The floor trembled faintly. The steel I-beams overhead seemed to carry the oscillation as well. I could hear a faint, high-pitched singing from the metal, a harmonic artifact of the subsonic input being translated into the audible range by the beam's natural resonant frequency. Then the water moved again. The same directional shift we'd witnessed the previous night. The entire film slid smoothly north toward the lake-facing wall. But it didn't stop after 6 inches. It continued. A foot, 2 feet. The leading edge of the water reached the base of the north wall and began climbing. Not splashing, not flowing, climbing. A thin, uniform sheet of water ascending the vertical concrete surface, as though gravity had become locally negotiable. It moved slowly, perhaps an inch per second, but it moved steadily, and it maintained a coherent film the entire time. No drips, no rivulets, no response to gravity whatsoever. Mia took a step backward. Dale stood motionless, his flashlight trained on the ascending water. I watched it climb to approximately waist height 3 feet up the wall and stop. It held there, a dark, wet rectangle on the gray concrete, roughly 4 feet wide and 3 feet tall, centered on the north wall. Perfectly still, perfectly defined. It looked like a window. The thought arrived unbidden, and I immediately rejected it as anthropomorphic projection. It was water on a wall. It was not a window. But the dimensions, the placement, the centered framing on the wall that faced the lake, the association was difficult to dismiss. Dale stepped forward. He raised his hand toward the wet rectangle on the wall. I said his name, once, firmly. He stopped, looked at me. His hand was perhaps 18 inches from the water's surface. I told him not to touch it. I couldn't have told you why with any precision. There was no evidence that touching the water was dangerous. Dale had mopped it off the floor with his bare hands on his second day. But the water's behavior had changed. It was no longer passive. It was no longer simply appearing and pooling. It was moving with direction, with coherence, and with what looked disturbingly like purpose. Touching it now felt categorically different than touching it before. Dale lowered his hand. He nodded. Mia was photographing the wall with her phone. The flash fired repeatedly, washing the room in brief white bursts that made the wet rectangle look like exactly what I'd been trying not to think it looked like: a window into darkness, framed in stone, looking out at nothing. The vibration shifted. The chest coupling sensation intensified sharply and then changed character. It was no longer a steady hum. It was pulsing, slow, rhythmic compressions. Not a heartbeat, the intervals were too long, maybe 4 seconds apart, but structured, sequential, deliberate. The wet rectangle on the wall began to change temperature. We didn't need the infrared thermometer to know this. We could feel it. Cold radiated from the wall the way heat radiates from a wood stove, tangible, directional, and strong. The air temperature in the room dropped. My breath became visible in the flashlight beam. Mia's too. Dale's glasses fogged at the edges. The cold intensified. It became physical. Painful on the exposed skin of my face and hands. My fingers stiffened around the flashlight. I estimated the air temperature near the north wall had dropped into the low 20s. In a concrete room with no ventilation, no mechanical system, and no physical mechanism for heat removal, the temperature was plummeting because of water on a wall. Mia said we needed to leave. She was right. Whatever was happening was no longer within the scope of observation. It was becoming an environment. The cold was affecting our manual dexterity, our decision-making clarity. My body was diverting blood from my extremities. In a few more minutes, we'd be dealing with the early symptoms of hypothermia, impaired judgment, slowed reaction time, and we were standing in a building whose behavior we didn't understand. We withdrew. Dale pulled the door shut, locked it. The three of us walked quickly back to the lot without speaking. The vibration was still present outside, but the cold was not. The mist had thickened. The air temperature was 36 degrees, uncomfortable but manageable. We sat in Dale's trailer with the heater running. Nobody spoke for several minutes. The silence wasn't empty. It was the silence of three people independently processing an experience that exceeded their respective professional vocabularies. Mia broke it. She said she needed to contact the park superintendent in the morning. What we were observing constituted an environmental anomaly of unknown origin that could represent a safety hazard. Protocol required notification. Dale agreed, but asked her to delay the specifics. He said if she reported water climbing walls, the park would send a mental health evaluation before they sent a geologist. He asked her to frame it as an engineering concern. Unexplained subsurface activity at a facility scheduled for demolition. Request for GPR survey and geological consultation. Keep it technical. Keep it within the bounds of what could be verified by instruments. Mia didn't like it. She said omitting direct observations from an official report wasn't something she did. Dale said he wasn't asking her to omit. He was asking her to sequence. Report the measurable anomalies first. Weight data, accelerometer data, conductivity data, temperature differentials, stress fractures. Let the instruments tell the story. If the park responded with appropriate resources, the water and the vibration would be witnessed by those resources directly. The phenomenon was consistent. It would demonstrate itself. If, on the other hand, Mia led with subjective observations of water moving autonomously, the response would be different. Skepticism, delay, possible removal of all three of us from the site. And the GPR survey, the one piece of equipment that could actually image whatever was beneath the building, might be deprioritized or canceled. Mia considered this. She didn't like the pragmatism of it. But she understood. She agreed to frame her initial report around the instrumental data and request an expedited geological assessment. I respected both of them in that moment. Mia for her instinct toward transparency. Dale for his understanding that transparency, in an institutional context, sometimes requires strategic presentation to be effective. The vibration ceased at 3:52 a.m., later than the previous nights. Duration increasing, amplitude increasing, frequency structure becoming more complex. Whatever was producing the signal was becoming more active. Whether that meant more energetic, more present, or more aware, I couldn't say. Morning. The overcast had lowered further. Cloud base was perhaps 500 feet above the lake surface. The mist had turned to a light drizzle that coated everything in a film of cold moisture. The mountains on the far side of the lake were invisible. Mia drove down to the main park road to get cell service and made her call to the superintendent's office. Dale and I went back inside the building. The lower level was dry. The wall was dry. No trace of the water's presence on the north wall. No stain, no residue, no mineral deposit. The concrete looked exactly as it had before. The same flat gray surface, the same dead acoustic quality, the same cold spot at the center of the floor. Though the differential had increased, the center was now 36 degrees. The perimeter was 49, 13 degrees across 20 feet. Dale set up additional instrumentation. He positioned a second accelerometer on the upper level for comparison. He placed temperature loggers at 4 locations: center floor, north wall, south wall, and the upper level floor directly above the anomalous zone. He deployed a humidity sensor. He mounted a fresh time-lapse camera aimed at the north wall, with a second camera covering the floor. I walked outside and went to the north edge of the granite shelf. The lake was 30 yards below me, its surface dimpled by drizzle. I studied the water for a long time. It was opaque in the flat light, dark and unrevealing. There was a steel cable anchored to the rock near the edge, a remnant of the sampling apparatus that the station operators had used to lower instruments into the lake. The cable ran through a rusted pulley bolted to a steel post and descended over the rock face to the water. I could see the lower end of the cable disappearing into the lake, about 15 feet from the base of the cliff. I grasped the cable, pulled gently to test its integrity. The steel was corroded, but the anchor was solid. The cable had weight. There was still something attached to its lower end, submerged in the lake. A sampling frame, probably, left in the water when the station closed. I held the cable for about 30 seconds. Then I felt it. Vibration, faint but distinct, transmitted through the steel from below the surface. The same frequency character I'd felt through the granite, through the building, through my sleeping pad. Coming up through the water, through whatever was attached to the cable's lower end, and into my hands. It was 10:15 in the morning. The nocturnal vibration was supposed to end by 4 a.m. Dale's 3 nights of observation had established that pattern. But the cable was vibrating. in broad daylight. The phenomenon was present in the lake continuously. What we experienced at night through the granite was merely the intensified version, the part that became strong enough to transmit through 300 feet of bedrock and concrete. In the water itself, transmitted through direct physical contact via a steel cable. The vibration was detectable all the time. I let go of the cable and walked back to the building. Dale was on the upper level, positioning his second accelerometer. I told him what I'd felt. He stopped what he was doing and looked at me with the expression of a man whose hypothesis has just been confirmed in a way he didn't want. He said if the vibration was continuous in the water column, it meant the source wasn't cycling on and off. It was constant. What changed at night was the coupling efficiency, the ability of the signal to transmit through the granite into the building. He speculated that temperature might be a factor. Rock contracts slightly as it cools. Nighttime cooling could be tightening the grain structure of the granite just enough to improve acoustic transmission. The signal wasn't getting louder at night. The rock was becoming a better conductor, which meant the source was always active. Whatever was down there was always resonating. We were simply unable to feel it through the granite during the warmer hours. Mia returned around noon. The superintendent's office had received her report. They were sending a geologist from the Regional Science Center, someone named Patel, due to arrive Saturday. The GPR unit was still scheduled for Monday. The superintendent had expressed appropriate concern, but no alarm. Structural anomalies at a decommissioned facility were not uncommon enough to warrant emergency response. Mia also brought something she'd found during a stop at the park's visitor center on her way back. A pamphlet. Not a park publication, a photocopied local history document produced by the County Historical Society. The kind of thing small-town volunteers assemble from old newspaper clippings and donated photographs. It covered the history of the Lake Ellicott area from the 1880s through the 1960s. She'd flagged a section about the lake itself. 2 paragraphs in a chapter on early settlement. The passage described a cattle rancher named Harlan Briggs who'd homesteaded near the lake in 1891. Briggs had attempted to use the lake as a water source for his herd, but abandoned the effort after 2 seasons. According to a letter Briggs wrote to his brother in 1893, the cattle refused to drink from the lake. He described them approaching the shoreline and then retreating with what he called considerable agitation. He attributed it to mineral content, alkaline or sulfurous water that the animals could detect. But he also noted that he himself found the lake disquieting, and that he frequently observed what he described as a trembling on the water that does not correspond with wind. A trembling on the water. In 1893, over 110 years before Dale Seward placed an accelerometer on a concrete floor and measured structured vibration at 3.2 hertz. The cattle wouldn't drink from it. Prey animals especially, are sensitive to infrasound. Frequencies below 20 hertz can trigger anxiety responses in livestock. If the lake was transmitting subsonic vibration in 1893, the cattle's refusal was perfectly rational. They were responding to a stimulus their nervous systems were designed to detect, and their instincts were designed to avoid. The rancher felt it too, a trembling, disquieting. He lacked the vocabulary to describe infrasound, but he experienced its effects and recorded them honestly. I set the pamphlet down and looked at the lake through the gap in the spruce trees. The drizzle had stopped. The water was still. No trembling visible from this distance. The afternoon passed in methodical work. Dale completed his interior survey. Mia cataloged the remaining archival documents and organized the hydrological data into a chronological summary that could be presented to the incoming geologist. I spent 2 hours on the granite shelf, examining the stress fractures more carefully, mapping their extent with a tape measure and compass. During that survey, I found something I hadn't noticed before. At the northern edge of the shelf, closest to the lake, the fracture pattern changed. The concentric cracks originating from the building's foundation petered out about 30 feet from the north wall. But beyond them, closer to the cliff edge, there was a different set of fractures. These ran parallel to the cliff face, horizontal stress lines, as though the rock was being pulled toward the lake or compressed from behind. I followed them to the cliff edge and looked over. The vertical rock face below the shelf showed the same horizontal fracturing. Thin parallel lines in the granite extending from the shelf down to the waterline, as though the entire cliff face was under lateral stress, being squeezed or stretched by forces within the rock. I photographed everything and brought the images to Dale. He studied them on my camera's display screen for a long time. Then he pulled out his notebook and began calculating. Load vectors, stress distributions, the mechanical implications of lateral compression in a vertical granite face. He closed the notebook and said something. I remember precisely because of how uncharacteristic it was for Dale to express uncertainty in professional terms. He said that the stress pattern I documented was consistent with the granite shelf being pushed upward, not from below the building alone, but from below the entire shelf. As if something beneath the rock was expanding or rising or pressing against the underside of the shelf across its full extent. The building's foundation simply concentrated the visible evidence because it provided a defined load point where the stress became measurable. The building wasn't the point. The building was incidental. It happened to sit on a piece of rock that something was pressing against from below. And it had been sitting there long enough to record the consequences in cracked granite and impossible weight readings. I asked Dale what could press upward against a granite shelf with that much force. He said he didn't know. Tectonic stress could, but the vector was wrong. This region's stress field was compressional from the west, not vertical from below. Magmatic intrusion could, but there was no thermal signature. Frost heave couldn't produce this pattern at this scale. He said the only model that fit was displacement. Something occupying a volume beneath the shelf that was larger than the space that had originally existed. Something that had grown into the rock, or risen into the rock, or filled a void in the rock that was itself expanding. Something that was still expanding. He closed his notebook and placed his pencil precisely in the spine. He looked old in that moment, tired in a way that sleep wouldn't address. Mia had been listening from the trailer doorway. She said the incoming geologist, Patel, specialized in structural geology and geomorphology. If anyone could interpret the stress patterns, it would be her. Saturday felt far away. That night, the vibration began at 11:58 p.m., earlier than any previous occurrence. The amplitude was immediately stronger than the night before. I felt it in my tent before I was fully awake, a deep, pervasive pulsation that seemed to compress and release the air in my chest with each cycle. The three of us gathered in the lot. Dale's wireless link to the accelerometer showed the same harmonic series, but the amplitudes had increased again. The fourth peak at 1.4 hertz was now the dominant frequency, stronger than the original 3.2 hertz peak. The fundamental was shifting downward, getting deeper. We approached the building. Dale unlocked the door. The darkness inside was thick with cold. Our breath formed dense clouds. The flashlight beams revealed the floor was wet the entire lower level this time, not just the central zone. wall to wall. A thin, continuous film of water covering every square foot of the concrete slab. The north wall was wet again, but the water had climbed higher. 5 feet up the wall. 6. It reached nearly to the ceiling on the north side, and I could see moisture beginning to appear on the east and west walls as well, spreading from the north corners as though the water were slowly painting the room from the lakeside inward. The temperature inside was 21 degrees Fahrenheit, 11 below freezing. But the water wasn't frozen. It remained liquid, which meant either its mineral content was depressing the freezing point significantly or something else was preventing crystallization. I could see my flashlight beam refracting through the thin film on the walls, a faint prismatic effect that shouldn't have been visible in water that thin. The optical density of the film was wrong. It was bending light more than pure water should. Dale checked his temperature loggers. The data confirmed the plunge. The center of the floor had dropped to 19 degrees. The north wall read 17. The upper level was 38 cold, but nothing like the lower level. The phenomenon was concentrated below. Then the pulsing changed. The 4-second rhythm we'd felt the previous night compressed. 3 seconds, 2.5, 2. The pulses were coming faster, and with each compression, the cold intensified slightly. I could feel it in my sinuses, in my eardrums. The air pressure in the room was fluctuating with each pulse, subtle but real, creating a sensation like rapid altitude changes. Mia was standing near the south wall, as far from the wet north wall as the room allowed. She had her flashlight aimed at the floor. She said my name. I turned. The water on the floor was moving again, but not directionally this time. It was gathering, collecting into a thicker pool at the center of the room, withdrawing from the perimeter and concentrating. The thin film at the edges disappeared as the water migrated inward, accumulating into a disk of dark water, perhaps 8 feet in diameter and nearly an inch deep. Then it rose. Not all at once. The center of the pool elevated first a smooth, convex deformation of the water's surface, as though something were pressing upward from below the concrete. A dome of water, 6 inches high, then a foot, maintaining surface tension far beyond what water should support. It looked solid, polished, a hemisphere of impossibly cohesive liquid rising from a concrete floor in a frozen room. It reached approximately 18 inches in height and held, perfectly still, perfectly formed. The flashlight beams reflected off its surface with the clarity of a mirror. And in those reflections, I could see the inverted room, the ceiling, the I-beams, the 3 of us standing in our respective positions, rendered with a fidelity that exceeded what the curved surface of a water dome should optically produce. The image was too sharp, too detailed, as though the water's surface were functioning as a lens rather than a simple reflective medium. Dale stepped forward, not toward the dome, just forward, shifting his weight, adjusting his position for a better view. The dome responded. Its surface rippled once a single concentric wave that originated from the apex and propagated downward to the base, then reversed and traveled back up. A response. Not to physical disturbance, to movement in the room. The pulsing stopped. The vibration stopped. The room went completely silent for the first time since we'd entered. No hum, no oscillation, no subsonic pressure, just 3 people breathing in a frozen room, staring at 18 inches of water that had risen from a concrete floor and was now holding its shape in imperfect stillness. The silence lasted 11 seconds. I know because I counted. Then the dome collapsed. Not dramatically. It simply relaxed, losing height smoothly, subsiding back into the pool, spreading outward again across the floor, resuming the thin film that covered the center of the room, as though it had been held up by something that had let go. The vibration resumed. Steady. The 4-second pulse returned. The temperature stabilized at its current extreme. Mia said we were leaving. She didn't frame it as a suggestion. She said it as a statement of professional judgment. The temperature alone constituted an imminent safety hazard, and we had no business remaining in an enclosed space at 17 degrees without proper cold weather gear. She was correct. We left. Outside, the mountain air felt warm by comparison. 34 degrees. We returned to the trailer. Dale turned the heater to maximum. We sat with our hands wrapped around ceramic mugs and said nothing for a long time. I watched Dale's face in the small overhead light of the trailer. He wasn't afraid. He was grieving. That's the only word for it. He was a man of instruments and measurements. A man who had built his entire career on the premise that physical reality behaved according to knowable laws. And he was watching that premise dissolve. Mia was different. She was processing the experience the way a field scientist processes unexpected data, not with grief, but with aggressive reorganization. I could almost see her constructing new categories, new frameworks, new questions that might contain what we'd witnessed. I was somewhere between them, old enough to have seen things I couldn't explain, disciplined enough to know that unexplained didn't mean unexplainable, but honest enough to recognize that the dome of water on that floor had not been the behavior of a mineral deposit, a geological anomaly, or any natural phenomenon I could name. It had responded to Dale's movement. It had formed and held a shape. It had produced an optical surface more precise than its physical properties should allow. And it had relaxed deliberately, as though maintaining its form required effort, and the effort had been withdrawn. Those were the behaviors of an agent, not an environment, not a geological process. An agent. I didn't say that word out loud. None of us did. But it was in the trailer with us, sitting in the silence between the things we were willing to articulate. Agent. Something down there was doing this on purpose. Saturday arrived under a sky that had cleared overnight, the clouds retreating east and leaving the basin in sharp autumn sunlight that made the lake look like a sheet of blue-black glass. The mountains stood in hard relief against a sky so deep it was nearly violet at the zenith. It was the kind of morning that makes you understand why people fight to protect wild places. And it seemed fundamentally incompatible with what we'd experienced 12 hours earlier in a frozen concrete room. Dr. Priya Patel arrived at 11. She drove a Park Service truck loaded with field equipment and carried herself with the brisk, uncluttered efficiency of someone who'd spent more time on rock faces than in offices. She was in her mid-40s, lean with weathered hands and close-cropped gray hair. She shook each of our hands firmly and asked to see the data before she saw the building. We spent 2 hours at Dale's folding table. Dale presented his structural findings methodically. Weight anomaly, load distribution, stress fractures, accelerometer data, temperature differentials. He laid out the numbers with the precision and detachment of a man delivering a technical brief, which is exactly what it was. Mia presented the hydrological history, conductivity trends, temperature anomalies at depth, the vibration reported through the sampling cable, the 1998 reassignment memo, the conductivity reading from the floor water. Patel listened with her arms crossed, occasionally asking for clarification. She examined Dale's calibration records. She reviewed the accelerometer output on his laptop, replaying the frequency analysis several times. She read the 1893 letter about the trembling water and the cattle. When the instrumental data was exhausted, Dale looked at me. I looked at Mia. Then Dale described what we'd observed directly. The water appearing on the floor, the autonomous movement, the climbing, the dome. Patel's expression didn't change. She didn't interrupt. She didn't display skepticism or alarm. When Dale finished, she was quiet for perhaps 30 seconds. Then she asked a single question. She asked whether the dome had cast a shadow. The question surprised me. I closed my eyes and reconstructed the scene. Our flashlights had been aimed at the dome from 3 different angles. The reflections had been vivid. But shadows, I couldn't remember seeing a shadow on the floor around the dome's base. The water had been dark. The floor had been wet. If there was a shadow, it would have been difficult to distinguish from the wet concrete. Dale said he hadn't observed a shadow specifically. Mia said the same. Patel nodded, as though the answer, or the absence of one, was informative. She didn't explain why she'd asked. She spent the afternoon on the granite shelf. She worked alone for the first hour, examining the stress fractures with her own instruments, a geological compass, a crack width gauge, a Schmidt hammer for testing rock hardness at various points. She took samples from 3 of the major fractures, sealing them in labeled bags. Then she asked me to walk the cliff edge with her. We followed the northern rim of the shelf from east to west, Patel studying the exposed rock face below us where the horizontal stress lines were visible. She photographed extensively. At one point, she lay flat on her stomach and extended her upper body over the edge to examine a section of the cliff face that was only visible from directly above. When she stood up, brushing grit from her jacket, she said the horizontal fracturing was not compressional. It was tensional. The rock wasn't being squeezed. It was being pulled apart. Microscopic separation along the horizontal planes, as though something were exerting a vertical tensile force on the cliff face, pulling it downward toward the lake. I asked what could do that. She said gravity, technically. But the magnitude of the tensile stress she was estimating from the fracture characteristics exceeded what gravitational loading alone could produce in a cliff of this height and geometry. Something was adding to the gravitational pull, increasing the effective downward force on the rock face beyond what the weight of the rock itself could account for. She walked to the sampling cable, grasped it, held it for 10 seconds, let go. Her face revealed nothing, but she took a handheld seismometer from her vest pocket, clipped it to the cable with a small C-clamp, and recorded for 5 minutes. She checked the recording on the instrument's small display, saved the file, and put the seismometer away. She didn't tell me what it showed. I didn't ask. Patel was the kind of professional who shared conclusions, not observations, and only after she'd verified them internally. We gathered at the table again before dinner. Patel had been making calculations in a field notebook with a mechanical pencil, filling pages with equations and diagrams I could only partially follow. She presented her preliminary assessment in careful, qualified language. The stress patterns in the granite were consistent with a concentrated subsurface mass anomaly directly beneath the building's footprint, as Dale's load data suggested. But the tensile fracturing on the cliff face indicated the anomaly's influence extended well beyond the building. She estimated the affected zone was at least 200 meters in diameter, centered roughly on the building, but extending beneath the lake. The nature of the anomaly, she said, was not consistent with any geological features she could identify. Dense mineral intrusions produce compressional stress in surrounding rock. This anomaly was producing both compression, the upward loading beneath the building, and tension, the downward pull on the cliff face. That combination implied a mass distribution that was geometrically complex. not a simple dense body, something with vertical extent, something that was interacting with the surrounding rock differently at different depths. She used the word interacting deliberately. I noticed. Geological features don't interact with surrounding rock. They exist within it. Rock responds to their presence passively. Patel's word choice implied something more dynamic, a relationship rather than a condition. Dale asked about the vibration. Patel said the seismometer recording from the cable confirmed the accelerometer data from the building. Same frequency structure, same harmonic series. But the cable recording was higher amplitude, which was expected given the more direct coupling to the water column. She said the harmonic structure was unlike any natural seismic phenomenon in her experience. Earthquake tremor was broadband. Volcanic tremor had harmonic characteristics, but the frequencies were different, and the geological context was entirely wrong. Microseisms from ocean waves or atmospheric coupling didn't match the frequency or the structured peak pattern. She said the signal most closely resembled what you'd expect from a large, mechanically coherent body vibrating at its resonant frequency. Something solid or semi-solid, with consistent material properties throughout, being excited by an energy source she couldn't identify. She said she wanted to see the interior of the building before dark. We entered together. The lower level was dry, as it had been every daylight visit. Patel walked the room slowly, touching the walls, examining the floor, checking the ceiling. She used her Schmidt hammer on the concrete in several locations. She placed her seismometer directly on the floor at the center of the room and recorded for 3 minutes. She stood in the middle of the floor and was very still. Not measuring, not observing, just standing, feeling. After a full minute, she said she could detect the vibration. Barely. A threshold perception. The daytime amplitude was almost too low to feel through boot soles on concrete, but it was there if you stood still enough and filtered out your own body's noise. She asked Dale to show her his thermal data. He pulled up the temperature logger output on his laptop. The center floor reading at that moment was 37 degrees. The north wall was 41. The upper level was 46. Patel looked at the data and then at the floor. She asked whether the cold spot had been present from Dale's first day or whether it had developed over time. Dale checked his records. On day 1, the differential between center and perimeter had been 9 degrees. It was now 13 degrees during the day, and had reached over 30 degrees during the previous night's event. The cold was intensifying. Patel wrote something in her notebook and closed it. She said she needed the GPR data before she could make any definitive statements. But she said one more thing before we left the building. She said that in her 20 years as a structural geologist, she had never encountered a subsurface mass anomaly that increased in magnitude over a period of days. Geological processes operate on timescales of centuries to millennia. If the cold was intensifying daily and the vibration amplitude was increasing nightly, whatever was producing these effects was operating on a biological timescale, not a geological one. She let that word sit in the air. Biological, not as a claim, as a boundary. She was marking the edge of her professional territory and acknowledging that whatever lay beyond it was not hers to name. The evening was tense in a way the previous evenings had not been. The addition of Patel should have been reassuring more expertise, more instruments, more professional credibility. Instead, it had the opposite effect. Her confirmation that the data was real, that the stress patterns were anomalous, that the vibration was structured, and that the time scale was wrong for geology. All of it removed the last comfortable possibility that Dale's instruments were malfunctioning. or that we were collectively misinterpreting ordinary phenomena. The data was real. The phenomenon was real. And none of us could explain it. Dinner was quiet. Patel ate sparingly and spent most of the meal reviewing the hydrological logbooks. Mia sat with her back against the trailer's exterior wall, watching the lake through the gap in the trees. Dale cleaned his glasses repeatedly, a nervous habit I'd come to recognize as his only visible expression of anxiety. I walked to the cliff edge alone as the light failed. The lake was settling into its evening stillness, that perfect, glassy calm that high-altitude lakes achieve when the thermal winds die and the air becomes isothermal. The surface reflected the darkening sky with fidelity. Stars began appearing in the water before I could see them overhead, the lake's surface acting as a more sensitive collector of faint light than my aging eyes. I watched the lake, and the lake watched nothing, because lakes don't watch. And I was a professional who had spent a career not attributing intention to landscapes. But I stood there anyway, and I felt the cable vibrating 3 feet to my left without touching it. The sound was barely audible, a faint tonal hum transmitted from the steel into the air, just loud enough to hear in the absolute silence of the basin. A sound coming up from 240 feet of dark, cold water. Continuous, patient. The same note it had been playing since at least 1893. When a cattle rancher heard a trembling he couldn't name. The vibration started in the granite at 11:31 that night, the earliest onset yet. Patel was ready. She deployed 3 seismometers, one on the lower level floor, one on the upper level, and one on exposed granite 50 meters from the building. Her instruments were research grade, substantially more sensitive than Dale's accelerometer. We monitored from outside initially. Patel watched her laptop, tracking the 3 seismometer feeds simultaneously. The frequency structure was consistent across all 3 sensors, confirming the signal was propagating through the bedrock rather than being generated locally within the building. But the amplitude decreased with distance from the building, which confirmed the source was closest to the building's footprint, directly below it or very near. At 12:15 a.m., the amplitude crossed the threshold where the building itself became audible. A low, almost subaudible groan from the concrete and steel, the structure responding to the vibration input like a resonating body, translating subsonic energy into the lower edge of the audible spectrum. It sounded like a building under strain, which it was. At 12:40, Patel said the seismometer on the lower level floor was showing a new feature. The harmonic peaks were splitting. Each defined frequency was separating into 2 closely spaced peaks, as though the resonating body had changed geometry or material properties. She said this was characteristic of a resonating system that was growing, increasing in size. The split peaks indicated the resonating body's dimensions were changing during the event, growing. I let that word settle into the same place where Patel's earlier word, biological, had taken residence. A resonating body, buried in granite beneath a government observation station on the shore of an alpine lake that was growing in real time, producing structured vibration, pushing water through solid concrete, generating cold, responding to human presence. None of those descriptors belonged in the same sentence. At 1:15, we entered the building. Patel wanted direct observation concurrent with her instrument readings. The lower level was already transformed. The water covered everything floor, north wall to the ceiling, east and west walls to roughly half their height. The south wall, where the door was, remained dry. The temperature was 18 degrees. Our breath came in dense white clouds that hung in the still, heavy air. The dome was forming as we entered. not yet fully risen, a broad, low convexity in the water at the center of the floor, perhaps 6 inches high and 3 feet in diameter. Growing slowly, smoothly, with the same impossible surface tension. Patel observed it without speaking for 2 minutes. She circled it, keeping a distance of about 4 feet. She aimed her flashlight at it from multiple angles. She held her seismometer near it, checking for localized vibration differences. She said the water was not being pushed up from below. There was no displacement wave at the base of the dome. The water was being drawn upward, cohering vertically, as though something above the dome were pulling it, except there was nothing above the dome but cold air and a concrete ceiling, or as though the water itself were deciding to rise. The dome reached 14 inches and stabilized. Its surface was mirror smooth. Our flashlight beams reflected off it with that same uncanny clarity, too sharp, too detailed, as though the curvature of the surface were being optically corrected to produce an undistorted image. Patel crouched at the edge of the dome's base. She extended one finger toward the water's surface. She moved slowly, deliberately. I didn't stop her. She was a scientist, and this was her observation to make. Her fingertip touched the surface. The dome didn't collapse. It didn't ripple. Her finger sank in approximately half an inch, and the water closed around it seamlessly, maintaining its shape as though her finger were simply another feature of its geometry. She held the contact for 3 seconds. Then she withdrew. She stood up and looked at her fingertip. It was wet. She rubbed it against her thumb. She smelled it. She held it under her flashlight. She said the water was warm. The air in the room was 18 degrees. The floor water was in the mid-30s. The dome was warm. She estimated body temperature, 95, maybe 98 degrees. Warm water, inside a dome of cold water, in a frozen room. Rising from a concrete floor above a granite shelf above a lake that had been producing structured vibration for over a century. Patel took a small sample vial from her vest and collected water from the dome's surface. She capped it, labeled it, and placed it in her pocket. Then she stepped back. The dome held for another 4 minutes. Then it subsided, as it had the previous night, smoothly, without drama, relaxing back into the film that covered the floor. The vibration continued. The cold continued. The water remained on the walls and floor. We withdrew at 2 a.m. because the cold was becoming dangerous. Even with the additional layers we'd put on, our core temperatures were being challenged. Mia's fingers were white. Dale was shivering. Patel showed no visible distress, but she agreed the conditions were beyond safe observation limits. Outside, in the relative warmth of 32 degrees, we stood in the lot and watched the building. The groan was audible from here now, that low structural complaint of a concrete building being vibrated at frequencies it was never designed to accommodate. It sounded like something in pain. Not sharp pain, the deep, chronic kind. Patel said she'd seen enough to make a preliminary recommendation. She said the GPR survey should proceed as scheduled on Monday, but she recommended that the area within 100 meters of the building be restricted to authorized research personnel only. She said the demolition assessment should be suspended indefinitely. She said the phenomenon warranted formal investigation by a multidisciplinary team, and she would make that recommendation to the regional science director personally. She did not recommend explaining what the dome had done. Like Dale, she understood the institutional vocabulary required to get the right response. Subsurface mass anomaly of unknown origin. Active geological phenomenon requiring investigation. Safety hazard to demolition personnel. language the bureaucracy could process without tripping its automatic skepticism filters. The GPR unit arrived Monday morning, operated by a technician named Jeff, who worked for a geophysical survey contractor. He was cheerful, competent, and entirely unaware of what he was about to image. The ground-penetrating radar survey took most of the day. Jeff ran parallel lines across the lower-level floor at half-meter intervals, then repeated the process on the exposed granite outside the building. The equipment used a 100 MHz antenna, appropriate for penetrating rock to moderate depth with reasonable resolution. Jeff processed the raw data on his laptop that afternoon. The four of us stood behind him as the images appeared on the screen. The slab was clearly visible, a bright horizontal line at the expected depth. Below it, the granite appeared as a more complex pattern of reflections and refractions, standard for crystalline rock. Then, beginning at approximately 12 feet below the slab, the image changed. A reflection boundary appeared, a clear, defined interface where the radar signal encountered a dramatic change in material properties. It wasn't horizontal, it was curved. A broad, convex surface arching upward toward the building from a depth of perhaps 40 feet at the margins to 12 feet at the apex. Like the top of a buried dome. Jeff adjusted his display parameters. More detail emerged. The reflection boundary was not smooth. It was textured, a complex surface with regular undulations that Jeff initially attributed to signal processing artifacts. But when he ran a second processing algorithm, the undulations persisted. They were real features of the boundary itself. Below the boundary, the radar signal was absorbed completely. Total attenuation. No reflections returned from below the curved interface. Whatever lay beneath it was either so dense or so conductive that it swallowed radar energy entirely. Jeff said he'd never seen a GPR profile like it. He asked whether there was a known void or structure beneath the building. Dale said no. Jeff asked if there'd been any drilling or excavation. Dale said no. Jeff looked at the image on his screen for a long time. He said the reflection boundary looked like the surface of a large, solid body embedded in the granite. Roughly hemispherical, approximately 30 meters in diameter. Its apex was 12 feet below the building's floor slab. Its base extended to at least 40 feet below grade, and possibly deeper. The total attenuation below the boundary meant he couldn't determine its full vertical extent. 30 meters, nearly 100 feet across, buried in solid Precambrian granite that every geological survey had described as continuous and featureless. It hadn't been there in 1969, when the Geotechnical Survey recorded solid rock to 40 feet. If the GPR image was accurate, this body had appeared or grown within the last 38 years. Patel asked Jeff to run his lines on the exposed granite outside the building, extending north toward the cliff edge. He did. The images showed the same reflection boundary, curving downward as it extended away from the building's footprint, descending into the rock at a steepening angle. Toward the lake. The last survey line ran along the cliff edge itself. Here, the radar showed the reflection boundary at approximately 60 feet below the surface, still curving downward, still descending. Whatever was beneath the building extended under the cliff and continued downward, under the lake bed, to a depth the GPR couldn't resolve. A structure at least 100 feet across and extending vertically for an unknown distance into the earth. Hemispherical at its apex, where it pressed upward against the building's foundation. Tapering or curving as it descended, following a geometry that connected the granite shelf to the deep water of the lake. Jeff packed up his equipment with the careful efficiency of a man who didn't want to think too hard about what he'd just imaged. He said he'd send the full processed data set to Dale within a week. He shook our hands and drove away. The four of us remained. Patel spread the printed GPR profiles on Dale's table and studied them for an hour as the light faded. She made measurements, calculations, drew cross-sections in her notebook that attempted to reconstruct the three-dimensional shape of the body from the two-dimensional radar slices. Finally, she sat back and capped her pencil. She said the body was not geological. No known geological process could produce a hemispherical mass of this size and density within granite over a period of decades. The growth rate implied by the difference between the 1969 survey and the current GPR image was orders of magnitude faster than any mineral precipitation, metamorphic, or tectonic process. She said the body was acoustically active, thermally active, and apparently capable of transporting water through solid rock to the building's interior. She said its geometry, a hemisphere pressing upward into the granite, connected to a deeper structure extending beneath the lake, suggested it was an extension of something larger. Something that originated in or beneath the lake and had been growing upward into the surrounding bedrock. The building's observation of increasing deep water conductivity and temperature anomalies over 28 years was consistent with this interpretation. The lake had been showing signs of the body's presence for decades. The building had been recording them faithfully until someone decided to close the station and separate the records. She looked at each of us in turn. She said she would include all of this in her report to the regional science director. She said she would recommend a formal research program. Seismic tomography, deep coring, submersible survey of the lake bottom, a long-term monitoring installation. She said she expected the recommendation would be received, reviewed, and very possibly filed in the same institutional architecture that had separated the hydrological records from the facility records. She said this without bitterness. She said it as a statement of institutional probability. The apparatus that managed these lands was designed to process the known. The unknown didn't have a form to fill out. I asked her what she personally believed was beneath the building. She put her pencil in her breast pocket and looked at the lake. The last light was draining from the sky. The water was already dark. In 30 minutes, it would be invisible. She said she believed something was alive down there. She said she used the word carefully and without commitment to any specific biological framework. But the characteristics, growth, response to stimulus, structured vibration, thermal regulation, material transport, those were the characteristics of a living system, not a geological one. She said she didn't know what kind of life could exist within granite, or how it could achieve the density and scale the GPR indicated, or what it was doing with the water it pushed through the building's floor, or why its activity intensified at night, or what the dome was. She said she'd been doing this work for 20 years, and she had never been this close to something she genuinely could not explain. She left the next morning. Dale and I stayed one more day to secure the building and pack his equipment. Mia filed her report and returned to her regular duties. The gate at the access road was relocked with a new padlock and a freshly printed closure sign citing structural hazard. On our last morning before we loaded the trucks, I walked to the cliff edge one final time. The sky was clear. The lake was calm. The cable hummed faintly in the still air. I stood there and tried to assemble everything I knew into something coherent. A body in the rock, growing, vibrating, pushing water upward through granite and concrete, responding to our presence, producing cold, forming shapes with water that reflected light too perfectly and were warm to the touch inside a frozen room. I couldn't assemble it. The pieces didn't form a picture I recognized. What I could do was stand there and acknowledge what I was feeling, which was not fear. Not anymore. Fear had been present on the first night, when the vibration woke me and I didn't know what I was feeling. By the end, fear had been replaced by something more durable and less manageable. Reverence is too strong a word. Respect is too mild. What I felt, standing on that cracked granite shelf above a lake that had been trembling since before anyone built anything on its shore, was the particular discomfort of recognizing that the categories I used to organize the world, living and non-living, geological and biological, intentional and mechanical, were insufficient. Not wrong, necessarily, just incomplete. The way a map is incomplete when it shows the road, but not what's beneath it. Dale found me there. He stood beside me for a minute, looking at the water. He said his demolition feasibility report would recommend against demolition. He'd cite structural concerns, subsurface instability, the need for further investigation. The building would remain. I asked him if he thought that was the right call. He said he didn't know if it was right. He said it was honest. The building was sitting on something they didn't understand, and tearing it down without understanding it would be either reckless or irrelevant. Reckless if disturbing the slab affected the body beneath it. Irrelevant if the body continued doing what it was doing, regardless. He said either way, the building wasn't the point. It never had been. It was a concrete box that happened to sit on the wrong piece of rock at the wrong time. And it had spent 28 years recording data that nobody wanted to read. We drove out together. Dale's trailer swaying on the switchbacks behind his truck, my own vehicle following. At the gate, he got out to set the padlock. I watched him test it twice, then test it a third time. He got back in his truck and we descended to the main park road and turned in opposite directions. Dale filed his report. Patel filed hers. The demolition was suspended. A research proposal was submitted to the regional science director, requesting funding for a comprehensive geophysical investigation of the Lake Ellicott subsurface anomaly. As of the last I heard, the proposal was still under review. The observation station still stands on its granite shelf. The gate is still locked. The access road is returning to the forest the way abandoned roads do. Then slowly, one season at a time, with grass in the cracks and saplings in the shoulders. I spoke to Dale once more, about 6 months after we left. He'd retired by then. He was living in a small house outside Fort Collins, organizing his career's worth of notebooks into a personal archive. He sounded well, settled. He didn't bring up Lake Ellicott, and neither did I until the very end of the call, when he said something I've thought about many times since. He said he'd been back to check the gate once in January. He hadn't gone up the road, hadn't approached the building, just checked the gate from the main road. He said the padlock was frozen shut, not from weather. The temperature that day had been in the high 20s cold, but not cold enough to freeze a lubricated steel lock. He touched it, and the metal was so cold it stuck to his skin. He had to pour warm water from a thermos over his fingertips to free them. The cold was in the lock, in the gate, in the steel posts that held the gate to the road. Spreading outward, he said, through anything that was touching the ground. He said it quietly, the way you say something you've accepted but haven't processed. Then he wished me well and hung up. I've driven past the turnoff for that access road twice in the years since. Both times I slowed. Both times I kept driving. Not because I was afraid, because I'd already stood on that shelf and felt what was beneath it. And going back wouldn't teach me anything new. The questions I had weren't the kind that repeat visits could answer. What's beneath Lake Ellicott is still there. Still vibrating, still growing if Patel's analysis was correct. Still pushing the boundaries of its container, whatever that container is, granite, water, the insufficient vocabulary of people who stood above it and tried to understand. Some mornings I think about Harlan Briggs and his cattle in 1893, standing at the water's edge, the animals refusing to drink, the man sensing a trembling he couldn't name. I think about the station operators who spent years lowering instruments into that water and faithfully recording numbers that told a story nobody wanted to read. I think about Dale's frozen padlock, the cold spreading through steel and stone, following the path of least resistance outward from something that doesn't recognize the boundaries we draw around our understanding. And I think about the dome. Warm water inside cold water inside a frozen room. A shape that held itself together and responded when we moved. A surface that reflected us back to ourselves more clearly than it should have been able to. I don't know what it was trying to show us. I don't know if trying is even the right word. But I remember how precisely it mirrored our faces, every line, every detail, as though it had studied them carefully and wanted us to know that it had seen us, that we had been observed in return.